I heard my daughter say it before I even stepped into the room. The doctor agrees. She's not thinking clearly anymore. I stopped in the hallway, my hand still resting against the wall, and for a moment I didn't move, didn't breathe, because there are some sentences that don't just land, they settle into your bones like they've been waiting for you to hear them. And in that second, I understood something very clearly. They weren't worried about me, they were preparing something. I had raised Lauren on my own after her father passed when she was 9, worked double shifts at a hospital cafeteria for nearly 25 years, saved every dollar I could, every overtime hour, every skipped vacation. Until I built a life that was quiet but stable, a 2-story house just outside Reno, a retirement account that meant I would never have to ask anyone for help, and I remember thinking back then that independence was the greatest gift I could give both of us, that if I never needed anything, she would never feel burdened by me, and yet there I was at 74, standing outside my own living room, listening to my daughter explain to someone else that I was no longer capable of making decisions. I heard a man's voice respond, calm, clinical, something about evaluation and next steps, and I recognized it immediately as Dr. Klein, the physician Lauren had insisted I see the week before. A routine checkup, she had called it, just to make sure everything was fine, and I had gone along with it because I trusted her, because I never imagined that concern could be rehearsed, that care could be coordinated, that kindness could have a purpose I wasn't meant to see. I stepped into the room then, slowly, deliberately, and both of them turned toward me at the same time, Lauren with that soft smile she used when she thought I might be confused, Dr. Klein with a clipboard in his hand, already watching me the way people watch something fragile, something unpredictable, and I said nothing, not a single word, because I had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you can do in a moment like that is react too quickly, show too much, give people confirmation of what they're already trying to prove. Mom, Lauren said gently, stepping closer, we were just talking about how you've been feeling lately, and I nodded as if that explanation made perfect sense, as if I hadn't just heard her decide my future from the hallway. As if I didn't understand exactly what not thinking clearly could mean when lawyers and documents got involved, as if I didn't know how easily those words could turn into signatures, into authority, into control. I sat down on the couch, folded my hands in my lap, and let them speak, let them ask their questions, let them write their notes, because something inside me had already shifted, something quiet but firm, and while they were busy deciding who I was becoming, I was already deciding what I was going to do next, and I remember thinking, very clearly, that if they believed I wasn't thinking clearly, then the only thing I needed to do was make sure that every thought I had from this moment on was recorded, documented, undeniable, because I wasn't confused, not even a little. I was listening, and for the first time in a long time, I was paying attention to everything. I did exactly what they expected me to do that afternoon. I answered every question slowly. I repeated myself once or twice. I even paused long enough between sentences to let the silence stretch just a little too far, because I could see it in the way Dr. Klein wrote on his clipboard and in the way Lauren watched me, hopeful and almost relieved, as if every hesitation confirmed something she needed to believe, and I let her have that. I let them both believe that I was slipping, because sometimes the safest place to stand is exactly where they think you are weakest. When they finally left, when the front door closed and their voices disappeared down the driveway, I remained seated on the couch for another full minute, listening to the quiet settle back into the house, and then I stood up without rushing, walked into my bedroom, and opened the top drawer of my dresser where I kept things that mattered, documents, old photographs, a small notebook I had not touched in years, and I took out my phone and placed it on the nightstand, staring at it for a moment before I picked it up again and opened the voice memo application, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that from this moment forward, every detail would matter. The first recording I made was simple, just my voice, steady and clear, stating the date, the time, and exactly what I had heard in the hallway, every word as close as I could remember it, because memory fades, but documentation does not. And I knew that if they were already speaking to a doctor about my capacity, then this was not a conversation that had started today. It was something that had been building behind closed doors, something planned, something deliberate. I sat at my desk and pulled the notebook toward me, writing down names, dates, appointments Lauren had scheduled for me over the past few weeks, the checkup that suddenly felt less routine, the forms I had been asked to sign but had not yet reviewed carefully, the way she had started handling my mail, offering to help with bills I had managed perfectly well on my own for decades, and as I wrote, the pattern became clearer, not chaotic, not emotional, but structured, like a plan that had been tested before being presented. I did not call Lauren that evening. I did not question her. I did not confront anyone, because confrontation would only give them the opportunity to adjust, to correct their mistakes, to close whatever gaps I might still be able to see. And instead I did something much quieter, something they would never notice. I began to keep everything, every text message, every email, every appointment reminder. I took screenshots, I saved copies. I created a timeline that existed outside of their version of events, something precise, something undeniable, because I understood that if they were building a case that I was not thinking clearly, then I would build one that proved exactly the opposite. The next morning, when Lauren called to check on me, her voice warm and careful, asking if I remembered what the doctor had said, I let a small pause linger before answering, just enough to make her repeat herself. And then I told her I was feeling a little tired, that I might need her help with a few things this week, and I could almost hear the satisfaction in her silence, the confirmation she had been waiting for, and I wrote that down too, the time of the call, the exact words she used, because I was not confused, not even close, I was watching. And every moment they believed they were gaining control was another piece of evidence I was quietly putting into place. I had always believed that patterns reveal themselves when you stop looking at moments and start looking at sequences, and over the next few days, that is exactly what I did. I watched how Lauren moved through my life with a kind of careful precision that I had never noticed before, how she arrived earlier than she used to, how she stayed longer, how she positioned herself between me and anything that required a decision. And I did not resist, not outwardly, because resistance would have disrupted the rhythm she was relying on, and instead I let her guide the conversations. I let her suggest changes. I let her bring up small concerns about my memory, my energy, my ability to keep up with things that had never been difficult for me until she started pointing them out. She offered to organize my paperwork, said it would make things easier for both of us, and I agreed, watching as she sorted through folders at my kitchen table, occasionally asking me questions that sounded harmless on the surface, but felt different when placed side by side, questions about account numbers, about where I kept certain documents, about whether I had ever considered consolidating my finances to make them more manageable, and every time she asked, I answered just enough to keep her comfortable, just enough to avoid suspicion, while making a mental note of each detail, later writing it down in my notebook with the same steady hand I had used for years when balancing my own checkbook. Jason started coming by more often too, always polite, always measured, but there was a shift in the way he spoke to me, a tone that carried a kind of quiet authority, as if decisions had already been made somewhere else, and he was simply reinforcing them. And one afternoon he mentioned something that settled heavily in my chest, something about making sure everything is protected moving forward, and I did not ask what he meant because I already knew protection in their language did not mean safety for me, it meant control for them. That evening, after they left, I sat at my desk and reviewed everything I had collected so far, the recordings, the notes, the timeline that was beginning to form, and I realized that while I had been documenting their words and actions, there was still a piece missing, something stronger than observation, something that would stand on its own without interpretation, and that is when I decided to do something they had not anticipated, something that would not rely on their version of events at all. The next morning, I made an appointment with a physician I had known years ago, someone entirely outside of Lauren's circle, someone who had no reason to see me as anything other than I was, and I did not tell anyone about it, not Lauren, not Jason. No one, because this was not a step I was taking for reassurance, it was a step I was taking for evidence. When I arrived at the office, I brought nothing with me except my identification and the calm certainty that had been growing stronger with each passing day, and I answered every question clearly, directly, without hesitation. And I watched as the doctor observed me, not with suspicion, but with professional neutrality, and when the evaluation was complete, when he told me that there were no concerns about my cognitive ability, that everything appeared normal for someone my age, I thanked him. Not with relief, but with quiet acknowledgement, because this was exactly what I expected, and more importantly, exactly what I needed. I requested a full written report before I left, a detailed assessment with dates, credentials, and signatures, something that could not be dismissed or reinterpreted, and as I walked back to my car in the late morning sun, I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not fear, but clarity. Because now I understood that this was no longer just about what they were trying to prove. It was about what I was prepared to show, and for the first time since I heard my daughter's voice in the hallway, I allowed myself a small, controlled smile, because they believed they were building a case against me, and they had no idea that I had already begun building one of my own. When I got home that afternoon, I did not rush inside or call anyone to share what I had just done. I simply walked through my front door, set my keys down in the same place they had been for years, and moved through the house slowly, deliberately, as if nothing had changed, because the most important part of what I had just secured was not the document itself. It was the fact that no one else knew it existed, and that silence was something I intended to protect. I placed the evaluation report in a folder inside my bedroom dresser, behind a stack of older paperwork that Lauren had not yet organized, and then I returned to the kitchen where she had been spending more and more time lately. Standing at the counter for a moment as I looked at the neat arrangement of bills and documents she had sorted for me, each pile labeled in her handwriting, each decision subtly shifted into her control, and I could see now how carefully it had all been done. Not rushed. Not obvious, just gradual enough that someone who was not paying attention might have believed it was help rather than strategy. That evening, she called again, her voice light but intentional, asking if I had remembered to take my medication, something she had never needed to remind me about before, and I answered in the same measured way I had the day before, letting my responses trail just slightly, allowing her to fill in the gaps with her own assumptions, because every assumption she made was another piece of the narrative she was building, and I needed that narrative to continue exactly as it was. Over the next 2 days, I noticed the pace begin to change, not dramatically, but enough to feel it. Lauren started mentioning appointments more frequently, small things at first, follow-ups, consultations, discussions about next steps, and Jason began using language that sounded more official, words like arrangements and planning ahead, and I recognized what was happening without needing them to say it directly. They were moving from preparation to execution, and whatever they had started with Dr. Klein was no longer just a conversation, it was becoming a process. I did not interrupt that process, I did not question it, instead I added to my own, expanding the timeline, attaching copies of every message, every calendar invite, every note they left on my kitchen counter. And I began organizing it in a way that would make sense to someone else, someone outside of this house, because I understood that documentation is only as powerful as its clarity, and I wanted every detail to speak for itself. On the third morning, Lauren came over earlier than usual, carrying a folder of her own, and she sat down across from me at the kitchen table with a seriousness that she did not bother to hide, and for a moment she just looked at me, studying my face the way someone studies a problem they are about to solve, before she said, "Mom, there are a few things we need to go over together," and I nodded slowly, folding my hands in front of me as if I needed the time to understand, as if I was uncertain, as if I was exactly who she believed I was becoming, and she opened the folder, sliding a set of papers across the table toward me, her finger resting lightly on the first page, guiding my attention, and I did not look down immediately. I looked at her instead, memorizing the calm confidence in her expression, the certainty that this moment would go the way she expected, and then I lowered my eyes to the paper, already knowing that whatever she had placed in front of me was not just a document. It was the next step in a plan she thought I would not recognize, and I let the silence stretch just long enough before I spoke, my voice soft, careful, exactly what she needed to hear, because I was not ready to stop them yet. Not until everything they intended was fully revealed. The paper she slid toward me was exactly what I expected and still heavier than I imagined it would feel. Not because of the weight of the pages, but because of what they represented: authority, access, control. All written in careful legal language that softened its intent behind polite phrases and structured paragraphs, and I let my eyes move slowly across the first page, not reading every word in that moment, but recognizing enough to understand what it was: a durable power of attorney, prepared in advance, waiting for my signature, waiting for me to confirm something they had already decided was true. "It is just to help you," Lauren said, her voice calm, reassuring, the same tone she used when she thought I might resist, and I nodded slightly, letting my fingers rest on the edge of the paper as if I needed time to process, as if the words were difficult to follow. And she leaned in just a little, pointing to specific lines, explaining what each section meant, simplifying it in a way that sounded helpful but felt practiced, like she had gone through this explanation before, maybe even rehearsed it. Jason stood near the counter, arms crossed loosely, watching, not interrupting, but present in a way that made it clear this was not just a suggestion, it was a step they expected to happen. I asked a few quiet questions, simple ones, questions that allowed them to explain more, to reveal more, and every answer they gave, every reassurance, every carefully chosen word, I stored it away. Because what they believed was a conversation was actually a record, one that existed now not only in my memory, but in the small device resting in my pocket, capturing everything clearly, every tone, every pause, every intention that sat just beneath the surface of what they were saying. "We just want to make sure everything is taken care of," Lauren continued, her hand resting lightly on the table, close to mine but not touching, and I could see the expectation in her eyes, the quiet certainty that I would eventually pick up the pen and sign. Because from her perspective, all the pieces were already in place: the doctor, the concern, the gradual shift of responsibility, and now this, the final step that would make everything official. I let the silence stretch again, just long enough to make her feel it, just long enough for her to repeat herself, to add more detail, to emphasize how important this was, and then I nodded slowly, as if I understood, as if I agreed, and I said, "Maybe we should look at it again tomorrow." My voice soft, uncertain in exactly the way she needed it to be, and I watched the brief flicker of hesitation cross her face before she smiled again, accepting the delay, because a delay still meant progress in her mind, still meant I was moving in the direction she wanted. After they left, after the door closed and their car disappeared down the street, I took the papers from the table and carried them to my desk, placing them beside the folder that already held my own documents, and for a moment I simply stood there, looking at both stacks side by side, their version of my future and mine, and I reached for the recorder, stopping it with a quiet tap before saving the file with the date and time, another piece added to something that was no longer just preparation but structure, something that was beginning to feel complete. I opened my notebook and wrote down everything that had happened, the exact phrases they used, the way Lauren guided the conversation, the presence of Jason, the document itself, and as I finished, I realized something that settled into me with a kind of steady clarity. They were no longer testing the situation, they were moving forward, and that meant I was running out of time to let them continue unchecked. Because the next step would not be a conversation, it would be action, and when that moment came, I needed to be ready, not just to respond, but to stop it completely. That night, I did not sleep much, not because I was afraid, but because my mind had already moved past hesitation and into precision, and when you reach that point, rest becomes less important than clarity, and clarity was exactly what I needed. I sat at my desk with both folders open in front of me, theirs and mine, comparing not the documents themselves, but the intent behind them, and it was no longer difficult to see the full shape of what they were trying to do. They had already begun establishing doubt about my mental state. They had introduced a physician who supported their narrative. They had positioned themselves as necessary support, and now they were asking for legal authority, each step building on the last, each one designed to look reasonable on its own, but undeniable when placed together, and I realized that what I had been documenting was not just behavior, it was a pattern of escalation. I reached for the phone again and made one more call, not to Lauren, not to anyone connected to her, but to an attorney whose name I had not used in years, someone who had handled my estate planning after my husband passed, someone who understood both the legal structure and the personal weight behind it, and when his office answered, I spoke clearly, calmly, requesting an appointment as soon as possible, not explaining everything yet, just enough to secure a time. Because I knew that once I began that conversation, everything would move forward quickly. The appointment was set for the next morning, and I wrote that down too, the time, the location, the purpose, adding it to the timeline that had become more than just notes. It had become a record of intent, both theirs and mine. When I arrived at the law office the next day, I brought everything with me, the recordings, the notebook, the independent medical evaluation, the copy of the document Lauren had asked me to sign. And I placed it all on the desk in front of him without rushing, without emotion, because this was not about convincing him of how I felt. It was about showing him what had been done, and more importantly, what was about to happen. He listened carefully, asked precise questions, reviewed the materials one by one, and as he did, I watched his expression shift from neutral to focused, not surprised, but alert, the way someone becomes when they recognize a situation that carries legal weight. And when he finally looked up at me, he did not ask if I was sure. He did not question my understanding. He simply said, "You did the right thing by documenting this," and that was the moment I knew I was no longer preparing alone. We discussed next steps in detail, not dramatic, not reactive, but structured, protective, and immediate, and he explained what options I had, how to secure my assets, how to prevent any unauthorized authority from being established, how to formally document my capacity in a way that would stand in any legal setting, and I listened, not as someone overwhelmed, but as someone confirming what I had already begun. When I left his office, I carried a new set of documents with me, not ones they had prepared, but ones that protected me, reinforced my position, and ensured that any attempt to move forward without my consent would not just fail, it would be exposed. That afternoon, Lauren called again, asking if we could meet later to finish going over the paperwork, her voice steady, confident, as if nothing had changed, and I agreed without hesitation. Because now it was not just about documenting what they were doing, it was about letting them complete the picture, letting them step fully into the version of events they believed they controlled, because when the moment came, when everything was finally placed on the table, I wanted there to be no doubt, no confusion, no room for interpretation, only the truth, clear, complete, and impossible to ignore. When Lauren arrived that evening, she carried the same folder from the day before, but there was a difference in the way she held it, a quiet urgency that had not been there before, as if she had already decided that today would not end the same way yesterday had. And Jason followed a few steps behind her, closing the door gently, his presence more deliberate this time, less passive, like someone who had moved from observing to ensuring. I was already seated at the kitchen table when they walked in, the papers they had given me resting exactly where I had left them, untouched, and I looked up slowly as Lauren set her folder down across from me, offering a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "I thought we could finish this today," she said, her tone steady, controlled, and I nodded, folding my hands together in front of me, giving her the silence she seemed to need to continue. She opened the folder and began again, walking through the document line by line, explaining each section with the same practiced patience, but this time there was less room for hesitation, less allowance for delay. And I could hear it in the way she emphasized certain phrases, temporary, for your benefit, just in case, each one carefully placed to make the request sound reasonable, inevitable, something that only someone truly confused would question. I let her speak. Let Jason add his quiet reinforcement from the side, let the explanation unfold exactly as they intended, because this was the moment I had been preparing for, not to interrupt, not to argue, but to let everything be said clearly, completely, without interruption. When she finally paused, sliding the paper slightly closer to me, placing a pen beside it, I did not reach for it right away. I let the silence settle between us, long enough for her to glance at Jason, long enough for him to shift his weight slightly. And then I picked up the paper slowly, holding it in both hands as if I needed to steady it, my eyes moving across the page in a way that suggested uncertainty, even though I already knew every word it contained. "I just want to make sure I understand," I said quietly, my voice careful, measured, and she nodded immediately, leaning forward, ready to guide me again, ready to close whatever gap she believed still remained. That was when I reached into my pocket and placed my phone on the table, not hidden, not emphasized, just there, visible, and I tapped the screen once, stopping the recording that had been running since they walked in, and I saw the smallest shift in Lauren's expression. A flicker of something she had not planned for, something she did not yet understand. I did not explain it, not yet. I simply set the phone aside and looked back down at the paper, letting the moment pass as if it had not mattered, because this was not the point where everything would be revealed. This was the point where everything would be confirmed. "Maybe we should go over this with someone else too," I added softly, lifting my eyes to meet hers, and for the first time, I saw hesitation settle into her gaze. Not fear, not fully, but something close to it. The realization that the process she thought she controlled might not be as contained as she believed, and Jason straightened slightly behind her, his posture tightening just enough to notice. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice calm but more direct than before, and I held his gaze for a moment. Before answering, still steady, still quiet, I already scheduled a meeting, and I let that sentence sit between us, simple, unadorned, but heavier than anything that had been said so far, because in that moment, the direction of the conversation shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably, and for the first time since this began, they were no longer guiding me forward, they were trying to understand where I was already going. The silence after I said it was not loud, but it was different, heavier in a way that did not need to be explained, and Lauren was the first to break it, her smile returning too quickly, too carefully, as if she needed to smooth over something that had already shifted beneath her. "A meeting?" she asked, her voice still gentle, but I could hear the edge now, the question behind the question, and I nodded once, keeping my hands still on the table, my posture exactly the same as it had been before. Because the strength of that moment was not in how I delivered it, it was in how little I needed to say. "With who?" Jason added, his tone more direct, no longer just observing, and I looked at him briefly before answering, not avoiding his gaze, not challenging it, simply holding it long enough to make the point clear. "My attorney," I said, and this time I did not soften the words, I did not pause. I let them land exactly as they were, clear and complete. Lauren leaned back slightly, her fingers tightening just a fraction on the edge of the folder, and for the first time since she had walked in, she did not immediately respond, and that hesitation told me more than anything she could have said. "Mom, we were just trying to help you," she finally said, her voice shifting, not defensive yet, but moving toward it, and I nodded again, acknowledging the sentence without agreeing with it, because this was no longer about what they claimed to be doing. It was about what had already been done. "I know," I replied quietly, and then I reached for the folder beside me, the one they had not seen, the one that had been building quietly over the past several days, and I placed it on the table between us, not sliding it toward them, not opening it. Immediately, just letting it sit there, present, real, undeniable. Jason's eyes moved to it first, then back to me, and Lauren followed a second later, her expression tightening just enough to show that she understood something had changed, even if she did not yet know what. I opened the folder slowly, methodically, and turned it so they could see inside, the pages organized, labeled, each one placed with intention, and I did not rush through it. I let each section reveal itself one at a time, the timeline, the notes, the copies of messages, the printed report from the independent evaluation, and finally, I picked up my phone again, unlocking it and placing it on the table beside the papers, the screen still showing the recording file from earlier that evening. "You said I was not thinking clearly," I said, my voice steady, not raised, not sharp, just firm in a way that did not need volume, and I tapped the screen once, letting a few seconds of their own voices play into the quiet room. Enough to make the source unmistakable, enough to make the intent impossible to deny, and then I stopped it because I did not need to prove everything at once. I only needed to show enough. Lauren's face had changed now, not dramatically, but completely, the confidence gone, replaced by something more uncertain, something that had not been there before, and Jason stepped forward slightly, his posture no longer relaxed, no longer controlled. "What is this?" he asked, but his question was already answered by what he was looking at, and I closed the folder gently, placing my hand over it for a moment before I spoke again. "This is everything," I said, "and tomorrow it is all going to be reviewed," and I let that sentence sit, not adding anything more, because I did not need to explain what that meant, not to them, not anymore, and for the first time since this began. The room felt different, not because of what I had done, but because of what they had just realized, that the story they had been building no longer belonged to them, and there was nothing they could say now that would take it back. The next morning, I arrived at the attorney's office 10 minutes early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to be settled before they walked in, and I knew they would come, whether out of concern, curiosity, or something else entirely. They would not stay away once they understood what was at stake. I sat in the waiting room with my folder resting calmly in my lap, my posture straight, my hands steady, and when Lauren and Jason entered, they did not speak to me right away. They checked in at the front desk first, exchanging quiet words with the receptionist. Their movements controlled but no longer confident, and then they turned toward me, and for a brief moment, no one said anything, because there was nothing left to clarify between us, only what was about to be decided. We were called in together, seated across from my attorney at a large wooden table, the same kind of table where decisions are made without raised voices, where everything is documented, where nothing is left to interpretation. And I placed my folder on the table, opening it with the same care I had used the night before, while my attorney began the conversation, not with accusation, not with emotion, but with facts, clear, structured, and supported by everything I had brought with me. He outlined the timeline first, the sequence of events, the appointments, the conversations, the introduction of the initial evaluation, and then he placed the independent medical report beside it. The one that confirmed my full cognitive capacity, signed, dated, and verified, and I watched as Lauren's expression shifted again, not in a sudden way, but in a gradual realization that the foundation they had been building was not just incomplete. It was contradicted. Jason tried to respond at one point, offering an explanation, something about concern, about responsibility, but my attorney did not interrupt him. He simply let him speak, and then he placed the recording transcripts on the table. The words preserved exactly as they had been said, and the room became quiet again, not tense, not dramatic, just settled in a way that only truth can create when it is laid out without interruption. I did not speak much during that meeting. I did not need to, because everything that mattered had already been said in the pages in front of us, and when my attorney explained the legal implications of what had been attempted, the seriousness of presenting someone as incapable without proper basis, the potential consequences of moving forward with authority under those conditions, I saw something shift in both of them, not fear exactly, but the loss of certainty, the understanding that this was no longer something they could guide or control. By the time the meeting ended, the papers they had brought remained unsigned, untouched, and the documents I had prepared were now part of an official record, one that ensured no further steps could be taken without my explicit and